So now we'll move on to Napoleon's political reforms in the second half of his rule. You'll remember from the previous video, I was mentioning that you can kind of split his rule up into two parts. That the first 10 years or so, he's very authoritarian, doesn't really extend much power at all to to an assembly, and if there are elections, he is only going to sponsor official candidates, which leaves very little room for an official opposition. So we're going to see this change in the second half of his rule. And one of the major things that he does is he extends the power of the legislative assembly. So remember, at first, Napoleon just straight up dismissed the legislative assembly when he became emperor. Now we're going to see that it's back, and he's going to give it a little bit more power. And the most important thing that he's going to do is that even opposition candidates are going to have more of a voice. So instead of that the sponsorship of official candidates in elections, right, kind of ensuring that the only people that are going to get a seat in the legislature are people that are going to go along with Napoleon anyway, we're going to see here that people who actually can oppose Napoleon's policies, his reforms, can be elected into the legislature. The other thing that he's going to do is he's going to set more parameters for elections of legislatures. So every 6 years they are elected, and they're elected by universal suffrage. So again, the Legislative Assembly is going to gain more influence in the second half of Napoleon's rule. We're also going to see that he's going to return the control of secondary education to the government. Remember previously when we were talking in the last video that at first, when he's trying to extend his presidency, this is before he becomes emperor, he does a lot of things to try to please the conservatives so that they will extend his term. And one of the things he did was the Fallow laws, which brought the secondary schools under the power of the church. Now this is going to be reversed. All right, so this is going to please some liberals and obviously non-Catholics. Remember also previously he had instituted a lot of censorship over the press, trying to control the any kind of power of liberals and especially radicals. He's going to ease back on that censorship. Also, anyone who was a political prisoner at that point, he's going to grant them amnesty. So that's going to be really significant. You see that, he's less scared of the opposition in the second half of his rule. He's also going to ease up on some of his previous economic regulations on the urban working class in particular. He's going to allow trade unions to exist, and they also will have the power to strike again. And he's going to support better housing projects, and a lot of that goes along with his economic reforms that existed previously. And you might ask why he is easing up on a lot of the previous restrictions. Why is he kind of instituting more liberal reforms in the second half of his rule? That's something I really want to talk about in class. Just a couple of speculations. First, when we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about his foreign policy. He's going to be much less successful in that area. So maybe he needs to do certain things that are more liberal to prevent too much backlash against his really unsuccessful foreign policy. Also, you see that, he's established control in the first half of his rule. Now he kind of feels like he can ease up. He can institute some things that are going to appease more than just the conservative classes, because that's going to promote even more nationalism. More people are going to support Napoleon if he does things that makes every person, urban, rural, poor, rich, happy. So, those are some suggestions as to why he does that, but we can speculate further in class. Okay, so like I was saying earlier, his foreign policy is much less successful. So there are a number of things that he does that cause especially the liberals to react against him. First off, during the period of Italian unification, which we're going to talk about 2 classes from now, he actually supports the Pope, who fled Rome in the early stages of Italian unification. So he sends French troops into Italy to bring Pope Pius back, and people who are more liberal and Republican in France are going to oppose this because they think that Italy should unify and that the Pope should not stand in the way. So by supporting the Pope with his army, This is going to make more liberal people in France upset with Napoleon. Also, you're going to see that France gets involved in the Crimean War against Russia. They're supporting the Ottomans in this instance. We're going to talk about the Crimean War next time. This is also going to upset Republicans and liberals because, they see it as an effort for France really just to just to oppose Russia, that they're clearly not involved in the conflict for religious reasons, which is really what caused the war itself. So again, there are going to be a lot of liberals who are opposed to France getting involved in this conflict. Also, liberals tend to be against military conflict in general. You're also going to see that France during this period is going to institute colonial rule over many different areas outside of the country. Algeria, some African countries, Indochina or Vietnam, and Mexico are some of the countries that France is instituting colonial rule. Again, this is going to really upset liberals in particular. A lot of them are going to also establish anti-imperialistic ideas. So they're very against France. They don't see it as nationalistic necessarily to try to control all these other countries. Um, and so going back to the previous slide where I asked why is Napoleon instituting liberal reforms, again, you could speculate that because he is seen as less successful in terms of foreign policy, maybe he's just instituting these liberal reforms to prevent any kind of revolt, revolution like we saw in 1848. And lastly, how does the Second French Empire collapse? Well, really importantly, France goes to war with Prussia, which we're going to talk about in much more detail when we talk about the unification of Germany. All right. During the course of this war, first off, France is defeated very, very handily by the Prussians, and also Napoleon is going to be captured by the Prussians. So this is going to cause the Second French Empire to collapse. Um, to evaluate Napoleon III's rule, I mean, yes, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, we see that the empire has collapsed. But nonetheless, one of the really important things for us to realize is that Napoleon is still kind of seen as a model for a lot of other political leaders in Europe. It shows us that you don't necessarily have to be liberal and nationalistic, that you can be conservative and nationalistic at the same time. We see that Napoleon, a very conservative person, was elected by a plebiscite twice, first to be president for 10 years and then to be hereditary emperor. So it shows us that you can have very strong feelings towards your country and not necessarily be liberal. And the way that he does that is by extending that universal manhood suffrage, right? Ultimately he realizes that he can be supported um, when everyone has the vote, even even when there was kind of an ideological divide coming out of the 1848 revolutions. So he's seen as, a very stabilizing candidate. Of course, that name recognition comes into play there as well. But you see that there is a pretty significant rise in nationalism in France, even among the more conservative groups that were not necessarily seen as nationalistic during the revolutions of 1848. So we will return to France later in this chapter, but for next time we're going to talk about the Crimean War, which is something important that is not mentioned in the book. So like Jupiter says, you're going to have a supplemental reading for that outside of the textbook, and it's definitely something that can be fair game for the EP exam, so it's important for us to cover. So until next time, I'll see ya.